Hi, and welcome to the last video of this seminar, History of English 2, from synthetic to analytic. In this session, we are going to focus on present-day English, that is, English as it is after 1900. In this video, we are going to discuss three topics. The first would be a rather general one, where we focus on the relationship between language and fashion and how we can better understand language if we compare it to our view of clothing and fashion. Then I'm going to briefly talk about a rather new development in certain varieties of English, the so-called S retraction. And at the end, I'm going to say something about a specific variety of English, Appalachian English, which will be the topic of our online session next week. Okay, so let's begin with our first topic, language and fashion. Okay, so what I would like you to do right now is to stop thinking about language for a moment and try to focus on how we think about clothes, right? And what parallels do you see between our thinking about clothes and our thinking about our linguistic behavior, right? And this is also something that you can do at home after you have watched this video, so simply as a general thinking task. But for now, please just follow my train of thoughts, and I would be really interested to hear about what you think about that and about aspects that you don't like and aspects that you agree with, and so on. Right, so I will now show you four pictures, and I'll say something about them. The first one, right, so a picture of an ambulance with the word ambulance written on it. Then another picture of an ambulance, but the word ambulance is written in a rather unorthodox fashion. Then the third picture is here a man in a yellow jacket waving at somebody. And then here, another picture of a man in sort of a yellow greenish swimming suit, also sort of grinning towards you. And the reason why I'm showing you this is to consider what is the distinction between the two pictures of the word, or between the two renderings of the word ambulance on the two first pictures, and then what is the difference between that and the way the two men are clothed on the second pair of the pictures. So we have here on the one hand side the word ambulance written as it is supposed to be written, and then the word ambulance written in a weird way. And we can compare it to this sentence, we went to the store with mommy, right? Which would be the correct way to say this. And then to the sentence rendered as we wented to the store with mumly, which would, for obvious reasons, be a very weird way to say that, right? Because for one, wented, went is already the past tense, so it's no use adding the ed ending to it additionally. And then manly is also not a word, right? So you have the le, the adverbial ending le added to the word mum, and then also spelled differently. So here I think you all would agree that the word ambulance, as well as the sentence accompanying the picture, is on the one side wrong, right? Ambulance written with two O's and so forth. And the other two things are correct, right? Ambulance on the left-hand side, and we went to the store with money as well. But then the second pair of pictures that I showed you on the previous slide, I'm not sure whether we would think in the same categories here. We would probably agree that the second picture from the movie Borat, right, is definitely a weird one, and you would not really you would not see as many people dressed like that at a normal beach, but who knows? And the other one is sort of more normal, more mainstream, but I'm not sure whether we would really think that the one is correct and the other one is incorrect. Because the big difference that I see when we think about fashion and language is that if we talk about language, we are sort of primed to think in terms of right and wrong, whereas if we think about clothing, we don't do that. If we talk about clothing, we are more likely to talk about appropriateness or inappropriateness. And if we do that, or when we do that, we always consider the context. For example, the occasion, right? So, for example, a tuxedo is not per se correct or is not per se incorrect, but it depends where you want to wear it, right? So if you wear a tuxedo in an opera, that's completely okay, and everybody would be happy. If you were, however, to wear a tuxedo at a nudist beach, that would probably be rather unorthodox, and you might get reactions if you do that. The same way it would also work the other way around. I mean, not wearing any clothes at all at a nudist beach is fine. That's actually the expected thing. But if you try to visit an opera not wearing any clothes, you will probably not be let in, right? But we will not. We would not consider being naked or wearing a tuxedo as correct or incorrect a priori, right? So we always consider the occasion and then think in terms of appropriateness or inappropriateness. Is this way of clothing or this style appropriate or inappropriate considering the situation? And we should also do that. That would be my proposal. We should also do that when we think about language, not to think about in terms of grammatical or ungrammatical, because this really doesn't help that much. I mean, there are things in language that are completely ungrammatical and unacceptable, right? The same way as it would be ungrammatical in fashion to, for example, I know, try to wear a sock instead of a hat, or wearing a T-shirt on instead of your shoes. Things like that would be completely off, right? But in terms of language, I believe that we should more think in terms of appropriateness or inappropriateness rather than ungrammaticality and grammaticality, right? So if we have, for example, here the sentence that you know from the previous slide, we went into the store with money, that's basically an incorrect sentence, probably. But what if this sentence is uttered by a 4-year-old child, right? Then all of a sudden, that would be okay, right? And we would not automatically correct the child that he used the endings incorrectly. At the same time, saying something like this, right? the traditional allocation of executive responsibilities has always been so determined as to liberate the ministerial incumbent from the administrative minutiae by devolving the managerial functions to those whose experience and qualifications have better formed them for the performance of such humble offices, thereby releasing their political overlords for the more onerous duties and profound deliberations which are the inevitable concomitant of their exalted position. There is nothing wrong with it grammatically, but if you were to speak like that when talking to a 4-year-old, that would be inappropriate. And by the same token, saying things like "we went into the store with Mamli" and using the endings wrong when you talk, for example, to the Prime Minister, that would also be wrong. But again, we have to consider the context, the occasion, and the extra-linguistic situation as well. So it's probably better not to think only in terms of right and wrong when we talk about language, but to talk about sort of appropriate and inappropriate linguistic behavior. The same way we would think we would talk about fashion and clothing, right? So there are things that are really ungrammatical and that are never appropriate, and then there are things that can be used in only in a very limited range of contexts, and then there are things that are okay to say whenever and wherever we want. Similarly, also clothing, right? So if we have a black tie or white tie, things like that, they are only okay. They are not incorrect or correct, but they are only okay in a very limited number of contexts. On the other hand, if we have a sort of a very sloppy style with a dirty t-shirt, a baseball cap, things like that, that would also only be okay and appropriate in a very limited range of contexts. And then there is this sort of mainstream, which would be okay and appropriate in a high number of situations. And if we talk about fashion and language, we can also talk about fashion change and language change, right? So women used to wear clothes like that, but the way women dressed developed over time, right? So we can actually see there are similarities between the different periods and between the different styles, right? There are always things that these women wear that they have in common, but then there are obvious differences. And we can actually say the same thing about the development of language and about language change, right? So we have here, if we begin with Beowulf in Old English, and then go over English in by Chaucer, and then we go forth by Shakespeare, and so forth, and then we end up in Twitter. We also see sort of changes, but again, there are things that are the same in both fashion and language. Another thing is that even if in language, if we talk about language and if we are taught language, for example, in foreign language classes, very often we hear things that are wrong and things that are right, and correct usage and incorrect usage and so forth. But in terms of fashion, it's really more about appropriateness, and even if somebody does something inappropriate, as for example here, Millie Bobby Brown from Stranger Things, wearing Converse shoes on the red carpet, which is inappropriate actually, but this inappropriateness is not understood as something incorrect, but as a statement, right? So it has a deeper meaning, probably. And linguistically, this can also happen. but this happens actually only in very specific contexts, right? So things like using the N-word or other inappropriate or banned words, or if we go in the other direction, using things like singular they to refer to a single person, right? So this would also make a statement. Another thing that we can see that where language and fashion intersect is the fact that we see a development and older and newer forms of clothing, for example, coexist together at the same time, right? So we have all these different types of clothing together, even though that we know that, for example, a T-shirt and a baseball cap is something newer than a white tie, black tie, or a more formal way of clothing, right? And the same thing can be said about language. It's actually known as layering, right? So there are different layers, older layers and newer ones in every language, right? So in English, we have, for example, a very old layer would be irregular verbs with vowel change, right? So sing, sang, song, things like that. On the other hand, we also have very new developments, such as the new because in constructions such as because reasons, because politics, and so forth. And then we have in between different different things that coexist at the same time, right? And this is also something that we see in fashion. And the thing that sort of leads us to correct usage of these different layers is the context. We always have to consider whether something is appropriate or inappropriate in the given context. Right. There is definitely more to say about language and fashion than this, but I'm going to wrap it up here, and we can discuss this on the forum. You can write me emails. We can also talk about that in our online session, but these were some just preliminary thoughts on the relationship between fashion and language and how we can actually gain something if we think about language the way we think about fashion. And now, something else, the so-called S retraction. Right. So it is something that people have observed in recent years in English that makes English sort of more Germanic, German-ish, whatever. Right. And for example, this is a entry from a blog where a person says, "My wife insists she isn't crazy, that more and more often lately she's been hearing people insert a tiny H sound in between the S and the TR in such words as strategy and street, said as strategy and street." And this is also something that you can hear in very official contexts, right? So here you have Michelle Obama, and now hear very carefully what she says.
And we are always stronger together.
Right? So once again, focus on the way she pronounces stronger together.
And we are always stronger together.
Right. So this S retraction is sort of an innovation where the S is pronounced further back in the mouth, which creates a sound that is more like sh than s, right? And it's mostly before consonantal clusters with T and R. And it can also work across syllable boundaries, right? So, and examples would be street, street, strong, strong, restaurant, restaurant, extra, extra, frustration, frustration, and so forth, right? So the pronunciation takes place in the more towards the back of the mouth than the normal S. And if you look at what people think about this, and this relates to the thing that we did last week on late modern English grammar writing and how people thought about innovations in the 19th century. Here you have some things about this S retraction from the 21st century, right? So you have here, right, random guy says only the media could pick up and run with a complete misuse of pronunciation rules and thrust them into common usage, right? So the media are doing something, right, complete misuse, utterly discordant and obviously wrong, right? Or here pronouncing stir like stir as in strong, strange, right? Again, they are ascribing that to journalists who are mispronouncing words, and this relates back to the fact that English is becoming more German, right? Where here Dave B says those stir people must be German, right? Straße, street. Okay, so there are plenty of meta-linguistic ideas about this one. But what we see here, and this goes back to a huge topic that has been implicitly present in all of our discussions throughout the last 11 weeks, and that is variation and change, right? So in this case, we have at least two variants of the pronunciation of the word, for example, street or stronger, right? We have either the more conservative one with the S sound, right? So street, stronger, strawberry, and so forth. And on the other hand, we have an innovation, a newer way of pronouncing that with a sh, right? So street, strong. So this is basically variation. And now what can happen is that either the one or the other way of pronouncing things actually prevails and becomes the norm. And it might be the case that in, for example, American English, this sh pronunciation will establish itself as the norm, but it might also be the case that this is only a temporary phenomenon and it will fade away again. Or the other thing that can happen is that in one variety, this newer pronunciation will become the norm, whereas in another variety, this will never happen, right? So, and in that case, you will then have one variety with this pronunciation and another variety with another pronunciation, right? And this is actually something that, again, might recall, or you might recall something similar that happened, and this is something we discussed 11 weeks ago when we talked about Germanic languages developing out of the Indo-European family, and that was the Grimm's Law, right? So that was also something that can be described as two varieties. One variety did nothing; they stayed the same, right? For example, the shift from P to F, right? So Indo-European languages retained the P pronunciation, and then the Germanic ones innovated their pronunciation and they shifted the P to F, right? So, for example, portare would be in Indo-European or pro or per, whereas Germanic would have something like an S and then would have for or fair. And then if this is the development, you get two different varieties or two different languages ultimately. But there is also another option that can happen, right? And this would be that simply this variation, this the fact that you have two different ways of pronouncing things depending on the context, this can also be retained. And it's not necessarily it doesn't necessarily happen that one wins and the other variant sort of loses. They can always stay the same and be in free variation for a very long time, right? Okay, so this was something about S retraction and something about the big topic of variation and change. And now let's have a look at Appalachian English, our last topic in this video. Appalachian English is a variety of English that is being spoken in this part of the US. And what we are going to do during our next online session is that we are going to read texts written in Appalachian English. It's actually a transcription of old recordings of people from this area speaking in their own variety of English. The place is Hartford in Tennessee, a small village town of approximately 800 inhabitants. The speakers have some level of formal education, but they are not really educated, and the person that you will hear talking and you will have the text that he produced worked as a farmer and then and later on worked as a deputy sheriff. The person is called Bill Barnes, and the recording on which the text that you will get is based originates in 1939, right? So almost 100 years ago. And at that point, Bill Barnes is 95 years old, right? So you have this connection between present-day English, sort of current after 1900, the way English looks basically now, and Bill Barnes being born in the period that we would consider to be late modern English, right? 19th century. So your task then would be for the next online session to have a look at the handout, and on that handout is a text, a transcription of Bill Barnes and his English, and your task would be to have a look at that at home and to try to find linguistic innovations or simply grammatical peculiarities that you find in the text. So what makes this variety special? What distinguishes it from standard English as you would use it? Another question would be, okay, whatever you find, would you consider these deviation from the norm more conservative or more progressive, and why? And a last thing that would sort of tie this together with our overarching theme this semester, would you consider any of the changes that you find in this particular variety of English to be more towards the analytic or more towards the synthetic form of language? And again, why? And please concentrate on things like verbal, nominal, or pronominal morphology, and also on negation. That would be all for today. Thank you all for listening, for watching, and see you next